Words fell over the elegant restaurant in the historic center of Bath like a heavy stone thrown into a calm, crystal-clear lake. Isadora Montgomery's silver fork remained suspended in midair, paralyzed halfway between the porcelain plate and her lips. Around her, the lively conversations of wealthy patrons went out one by one, like candles blown by a sudden icy wind that invaded the room. Even the pianist, playing softly in the corner of the dining room, missed a note, leaving an awkward silence over the tables decorated with flowers. Isadora raised her eyes very slowly, trying to understand the source of this interruption to her solitary lunch. Before her, standing and huddled close to the table, was a young woman who couldn't be more than 26 years old. She wore a grey shirt torn at the shoulders, trousers frayed at the knees, and shoes so worn by time they barely kept their original shape. Over one of her thin shoulders, she carried a huge, heavy black bin bag tied tightly, as if she kept her entire world inside. Her face was smudged with street dirt, and a few clean lines cut through the visible grime, showing the recent path of fallen tears. But what truly froze the heart of the powerful real estate mogul Isadora was not the torn clothes nor the obvious dirt of the streets, but the young woman's eyes. They were dark, large eyes, adorned with very long eyelashes, holding a deep dignity that all the misery in the world could not erase. They were eyes Isadora knew intimately, eyes that had ruthlessly haunted her saddest dreams for the last 22 years. With a trembling and choked voice, very different from the firm tone she used in board meetings, Isadora could only whisper a weak question about what the young woman had said. The girl quickly lowered her head, and a deep blush flushed her cheeks beneath the dirt covering her tired face. She apologized in a dry voice, explaining that she did not mean to bother, but she had not tasted a single bite of food for 3 whole days. She explained that she saw the bread and half of the fish Isadora was about to leave on the plate, and, overcome by extreme hunger, found the courage to ask for the leftovers. The young woman's voice broke mid-sentence, and she quickly turned to leave, feeling the weight of humiliation crushing her shoulders. The word "wait" escaped Isadora's lips before she could think rationally about what she was about to do in that posh restaurant. Several heads turned at neighboring tables, and an arrogant woman wearing an emerald necklace clicked her tongue with audible, deep contempt. A man in a grey suit muttered something unpleasant to his companion, gesturing toward the young woman with his chin, as if pointing to a stray dog that had invaded a garden. Reginald, the restaurant manager, a thin man with a neat moustache, was already approaching with fast steps, hands outstretched, and a rehearsed apologetic smile on his face. The manager began to apologize profusely to Isadora for the unwanted interruption, and then turned to the young woman with an unforgiving harshness in his eyes, barking that he had told her many times she could not enter, grabbing her arm tightly and threatening to call security immediately. Isadora's order cut through the restaurant air like a sharp blade, demanding that the manager not touch the young woman under any circumstances. Isadora Montgomery had built a colossal real estate empire, and when she used that specific tone of voice, the entire world around her stopped to obey. Reginald quickly released the girl's arm, as if her skin were burning his fingers, and tried to argue that she was just a vagrant. Isadora corrected him sharply, emphasizing every syllable as she declared that this young lady was her guest of honor for lunch. She ordered the manager to bring a comfortable chair and clean cutlery, making the silence in the restaurant so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. The woman with the emeralds dropped her crystal glass, and the young woman stepped back, murmuring fearfully that she didn't want to cause trouble and wasn't worth it. The phrase, "I'm not worth it," pierced Isadora's chest like a poisoned splinter, bringing up old pains she tried to forget. She asked who had told such a cruel lie to the young woman, but the girl did not answer, keeping her eyes fixed on her completely ruined shoes. Isadora asked her to sit down, And this time it did not sound like the order of a wealthy woman, but rather a sincere plea from someone lonely. Reginald, entirely defeated by the businesswoman's authority, pulled out a chair, and the girl sat down slowly, hugging her black bag as if it were a protective shield against the world.
Isadora asked the young woman's name with a rare sweetness, and the girl replied in a fragile whisper that her name was Grace. Isadora closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. The name was different, but the eyes and expression were identical to those of her little lost Victoria, gone for so long. When Grace confessed she was starving and could no longer remember the taste of a hot meal, Isadora's heart tightened in compassionate pain. She called the manager again and,
with unyielding firmness, ordered them to bring the house's best dish with fresh fish, soup, freshly baked bread, and a chocolate dessert for her new guest. Grace watched all this activity with wide eyes, as if living a beautiful dream from which she was terrified to wake. She whispered, "Why is such an important and elegant lady doing this for a dirty stranger who only asked for scraps?" Isadora remained silent for a long moment, looking out at the cobbled street where life went on, completely oblivious to the emotional earthquake happening at that table. Finally, Isadora replied with a voice heavy with melancholy that, a long time ago, she too had felt a desperate hunger for something that all her money could never buy. Grace confessed that she had been living on the streets of the city for about 8 months, a long and sad story that she believed would ruin the businesswoman's refined lunch.
Isadora assured her that she had all the time in the world and had heard and lived through extremely difficult stories in her own life journey. At that exact moment, the waiters arrived and laid out on the table, now covered with an impeccable white tablecloth, a succession of wonderful delicacies that exhaled a welcoming aroma. There was steaming soup, grilled fish with fresh vegetables, a basket of golden bread, and a pitcher of fresh juice, making Grace close her eyes and breathe in deeply.
Isadora encouraged Grace to eat everything she wanted in absolute peace, promising that if she wanted more, there would be plenty more at her disposal. Grace picked up the spoon with trembling hands, brought it to the soup, but before tasting it, looked at Isadora with eyes wet with pure gratitude. She thanked her emotionally, saying that no one had treated her with kindness in a very long time, and that most people looked at her as if she weren't even a human being. Isadora held the young woman's dirty hand over the table, affirming with conviction that the only difference between the two of them was luck, and that luck was a wheel that turned. While Grace ate, first with a certain shame and then with a heart-breaking hunger, Isadora watched her in deep and reflective silence. The wealthy businesswoman's mind traveled 22 years back in time, returning to a terrible stormy night, a cold hospital, and a small white coffin being closed. But as she watched the way Grace furrowed her brow when chewing, and especially when she noticed a tiny dark mole beneath the young woman's left ear, an impossible suspicion began to bloom. Isadora's heart raced wildly. Her daughter had died. She herself had attended the painful funeral, but those physical traits were a coincidence too shocking to ignore. With her voice choked by contained emotion, Isadora asked the young woman if she knew who her real parents were or where she came from.
A dark shadow crossed Grace's face, who stopped eating, and explained that she grew up in St. Jude's orphanage, where she was told she had been abandoned when she was just a baby. Grace confessed sadly that this was why she thought she wasn't worth it, believing that not even her own biological mother had loved her enough to stay with her. The silver fork slipped from Isadora's hand and hit the porcelain plate with a dull clink,
making the entire world stop spinning around her for an eternal instant. The name of the orphanage and the mention of abandonment spun in Isadora's mind like a furious hurricane, mixing with all the painful memories she had tried to bury under years of overwork. Grace, noticing the sudden paleness on the older woman's face, asked in alarm if she was feeling unwell and needed a glass of water or medical help. Isadora blinked several times to brush away imminent tears and forced a gentle smile, assuring the young woman she was perfectly fine, and asked her to keep eating before the food got cold. The restaurant had regained its usual murmur, but the woman in the emerald necklace, still outraged by the situation, called the manager to make one more absurd demand. The rich woman demanded that Reginald expel the girl immediately, threatening never to set foot in that luxury establishment again if she had to share the space with a vagabond. Isadora stood up with icy calm and walked over to the woman's table, towering with the authority of someone who had built a formidable financial empire from scratch. With an extremely polite but joyless smile, Isadora formally introduced herself and revealed that she owned that entire block, including the building the restaurant rented. Isadora humiliated the elegant woman, saying that true poverty was that of the heart, and suggested she leave immediately, as no one there would miss her. The woman with the emeralds turned red with pure humiliation, grabbed her purse quickly and stomped out onto the cobblestones, while a few customers in the back clapped timidly. When Isadora returned to the table, Grace looked at her with wide eyes, surprised that someone had defended her honor in such a grand and brave way. Isadora smiled softly, poured more juice for the young woman, and said it was high time someone did something good for her in this difficult life.
It was at that exact moment that a timid smile with a small dimple on Grace's right cheek appeared, an image that confirmed the wildest suspicions of Isadora's wounded heart. Isadora asked Grace to tell her good things about herself, her dreams, and the things she loved to do before life on the streets stole her hope. Grace confessed her deep love for books, telling how she had read St. Jude's Small Library several times, and that her greatest dream was to be a teacher to teach children.
She had even won a university scholarship, but the malice of people had derailed her from that bright path, throwing her onto the street and making her believe she was just a useless burden on the world. The warm chocolate dessert arrived, and Grace wept openly as she tasted the sweet dish, held tightly by Isadora, who invited her to spend the night in her large, secure mansion. The imposing Montgomery mansion rose majestically on top of a quiet hill, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and ancient trees swaying gently under the starry sky of Bath. As the black limousine crossed the grand wrought-iron gates and began to climb the long gravel driveway, Grace pressed her face against the car window, her mouth slightly open in pure admiration. She whispered, startled by such wealth, that the place was much larger than the entire orphanage where she had grown up, feeling more out of place and tiny than ever before in her life. Isadora sighed deeply and replied that such a massive house, without the laughter of a family to fill it, was nothing more than an elegant and lonely mausoleum. The limousine stopped smoothly before a grand white marble staircase, and the driver opened the door for Grace to step out with extreme shyness, clutching her old bin bag. Catherine, the loyal housekeeper who had worked at the mansion for 30 years, was waiting at the entrance in her starched apron, looking at the ragged young woman with a mixture of shock and silent questioning. Isadora introduced Grace formally and ordered Catherine to prepare the blue room immediately, as well as arrange a hot bath with salts and clean, comfortable clothes that would fit the girl. Catherine widened her eyes, unable to hide her absolute astonishment, because the door to the blue room had been locked and sealed for more than 22 years. While Grace walked up the staircase,
marveling at the grand crystal chandeliers, Isadora felt her legs weaken and had to hold tightly to the noble wood banister to keep from collapsing with emotion. She walked slowly to her private study, locked the door, and opened a safe hidden behind a painting, from which she retrieved an old velvet box, worn by time. Inside the box lay yellowed photographs and a small hospital wristband, precious keepsakes of her late husband Edward and her daughter Victoria.
The miracle life had seemingly stolen from her. Isadora examined a specific photo of the baby and confirmed that the tiny dark mole under the left ear was identical to the mark she had seen on Grace's face during lunch. The painful memories of that rainy night in the hospital flooded Isadora's mind. The child's sudden fever, the vague excuses of the doctor, and the nurse who had mysteriously vanished the next day. A wild hope mixed with paralyzing fear began to take hold of her, making her wonder if her daughter had not actually died, but had been stolen and abandoned at St. Jude's orphanage. Isadora made a firm decision to investigate everything with the utmost discretion, hiring the best private detectives available to uncover the absolute truth before raising false hopes that could destroy both of them. Shortly after, a soft knock on the door interrupted her turbulent thoughts, and Grace's sweet voice announced she was ready to come down for dinner. When Isadora opened the study door, she was completely breathless at the miraculous transformation that the hot bath and clean clothes had wrought on the young guest. Grace wore an ivory cashmere sweater and soft trousers, her dark hair falling in shiny waves over her shoulders, glowing with a beauty that the street grime had concealed. The young woman asked, still full of insecurities, if she looked presentable enough to sit at the table,
fearing she was abusing her generous hospitality and using too much hot water during her long bath. Isadora, with unshed tears in her eyes, assured her she looked like a true princess and that she could use all the water in the world without feeling any guilt. They dined together in the immense dining room, and Isadora asked Grace to sit close to her, breaking the icy formality that had dominated that table for over 2 decades. They chatted animatedly about books, interrupted dreams,
and the small beauties of life, allowing Isadora to temporarily forget her terrible suspicions to simply enjoy the company and crystal-clear laughter of the young woman. That same night, while Grace slept peacefully in the blue room, the untouched sanctuary of Isadora's grief, the matriarch stood in the hallway, listening to the girl's quiet breathing. Isadora could not close her eyes and spent the entire night on the phone, hiring Private Detective Turner, demanding he find the orphanage records and the missing nurse named Diana Rydell. The next 3 weeks brought a silent but powerful revolution, transforming the Montgomery mansion from a luxurious tomb into a true home, full of human warmth and vibrant life. Grace proved to be an extraordinary young woman, happily helping Catherine in the spacious kitchen, caring for the roses in the immense garden with affection, and reading books aloud to Isadora on cold nights. While enjoying the days with the girl, Isadora lived in deep anxiety during the night, anxiously devouring every report Detective Turner sent about the progress of his complex investigations. The genuine affection between the two women grew with each sunrise, strengthening an invisible bond that seemed to have existed forever, long before their chance encounter in the elegant restaurant in Bath. Finally, on a grey and rainy afternoon, Detective Turner arrived at the mansion, holding a bulky brown envelope under his arm, asking to speak with Isadora as a matter of absolute urgency. He sat across from the study desk and revealed without beating around the bush that he had found Nurse Diana Rydell in a small town 200 kilometers away, suffering from a severe terminal cancer. Turner opened the envelope, handing over old photographs and a digital recorder, stating that the sick woman had wept copiously with relief when questioned, as she had waited 22 years to confess her crime. Isadora held the evidence with trembling hands, feeling the air escape her lungs as she prepared to listen to the dark truth that would rewrite her entire life story. The silence in the study was dense and oppressive, broken only by the melancholy sound of heavy rain violently lashing the grand stained glass windows of the imposing Montgomery mansion. Detective Turner took a deep breath and revealed to Isadora that little Victoria had never died of that fever on that rainy night. The child had recovered perfectly under medical care. The terrible truth was that Arnold, Isadora's envious brother-in-law, who had always coveted his brother Edward's fortune, paid an exorbitant amount of money to the nurse to make the baby disappear. If the girl did not exist, Arnold would inherit half of the gigantic business empire, and it was this very unbridled greed that led him to commission the theft of his own niece. Turner explained that Diana Rydell, the bribed nurse, did not have the brutal coldness required to murder the innocent newborn as the uncle's nefarious plans demanded. Instead of committing murder, she forged the death records at the hospital with the help of corrupt doctors and took the child in the dead of night to a distant city. Diana abandoned the little baby at the door of St. Jude's orphanage, without any documents or surname, ensuring at least that the girl had a real chance to survive the Machiavellian conspiracy. Isadora listened to every macabre detail with hands covering her mouth while thick, painful tears washed her face, thinking of the 22 years of suffering they both had unjustly endured. The detective presented the old orphanage documents which matched the story perfectly, proving that the girl registered without a surname as Grace was indeed the stolen heiress.
Isadora questioned through desperate sobs how she could be absolutely sure, because if she revealed this whole wild story to the young woman and there was an error, the emotional impact would destroy both of their minds. Turner, ever professional and calculating, suggested that the only scientific and irrefutable way to prove the connection was to conduct a confidential DNA test at a highly trusted laboratory. That same night, Isadora quietly entered the blue room and, her heart leaping in her chest, collected a small saliva sample from Grace's cheek while the young woman slept deeply. The hours that followed were true psychological torture for Isadora, who could barely eat or sleep, consumed by an anxious expectation that ate away at her. Grace, noticing the drastic change in the matriarch's behavior, approached gently and asked if she had done something wrong, offering to leave and return to the streets if she was causing trouble. Isadora held the young woman's hands tightly, trying to contain her tears, and assured her she would never be trouble, explaining only that she was waiting for very important news that would change everything. Finally, the study phone rang loudly. It was Detective Turner, informing her that the lab results were in and the genetic compatibility was 99.99%. Isadora dropped the phone onto the thick Persian rug and collapsed to her knees on the study floor, hugging her own body as a primitive, guttural cry tore from her dry throat. It was a cry that mixed the agonizing pain of 2 decades of unjust grief with the indescribable joy of knowing her beloved daughter was alive and breathing under her own roof. After nearly an hour of intense emotional release, Isadora washed her face in the restroom, looked at herself in the large mirror with a new determination, and went down the marble stairs to find her girl. Grace was curled up on the soft living room sofa, reading an old book. Bathed in the golden, poetic late afternoon light streaming through the open windows, Isadora sat very close to Grace, took both of her hands, and looked deep into those large, dark eyes that had been her greatest longing throughout her life. With a trembling voice but carrying absolute certainty, Isadora began to tell the story of the daughter she lost in the hospital, the theft planned by her brother-in-law, and the nurse who abandoned her. When Isadora mentioned the name of St. Jude's orphanage, the heavy book slipped from Grace's hands and hit the wooden floor with a dull thud as shock drained the color from her face. Grace began to tremble uncontrollably, stammering that it couldn't be true, that it was just a soap opera plot, and she was just a worthless orphan who lived on the streets. Isadora gently touched the small mole under the young woman's ear and explained that her father, Edward, had painted the clouds on the ceiling of the blue room with his own hands before he passed away. She pulled the official lab paper from her pocket and handed it to Grace's trembling hands, asking her to read the printed names and the scientific percentage that left no room for doubt. Grace's wide eyes scanned the cold numbers, and when she finally understood the monumental truth, the word mother escaped her lips like a hushed prayer that had waited a lifetime to be spoken. The two women embraced with desperate strength, weeping in each other's arms in the middle of the huge living room, healing the open wounds of 22 years of cruel loneliness in the warmth of that physical contact. After the emotional storm subsided, Grace opened her wounded heart and revealed to her mother the dark reason
that had thrown her into the misery of the pavements and the cold of the streets. She spoke about Roderick, a manipulative man she met at university,
who pretended to love her only to convince her to sign fraudulent loans in her name before fleeing with all the stolen money. Grace was hounded by violent debt collectors and ended up losing absolutely everything, living hidden and terrified in the shadows, feeling like the most disposable and useless person on earth. Isadora felt her blood boil with rage and promised, with the protective coldness of a lioness,
that she would use all her power and money to destroy Roderick if he ever dared cross their path. What they did not know was that Roderick was hiding in a dark car near the mansion, plotting a terrible plan with Arnold to steal the fortune that now belonged to Grace. Arnold Montgomery, the greedy and calculating uncle, poured himself a generous measure of imported whiskey in his luxurious office, watching the young, unscrupulous Roderick with a look of deep disdain. Roderick had sought out the older man after discovering Grace's true whereabouts, realizing that the orphan he had ruined and thrown onto the streets was actually the legitimate heiress of a multi-billion-pound empire. With a wicked smile on his face, Roderick proposed a dark alliance. He knew all of Grace's vulnerabilities and traumas, and together they could spin a perfect web of lies to emotionally destroy her. The devilish plan did not involve physical violence, as that would attract the police, but rather planting toxic seeds of doubt in Isadora's newly healed heart, making her believe her own daughter was a manipulative fraud. The cruel strategy relied on forging documents, manipulating old photographs, and hiring false witnesses to convince Isadora that Grace had always known her true identity even before their fateful meeting at that Bath restaurant.
They wanted the powerful businesswoman to believe that the moving plea for food scraps and the tears of hunger were nothing but a theatrical performance orchestrated by Grace and Roderick to steal the vast family inheritance. Arnold smiled with repulsive satisfaction, realizing that a mother who has just reunited with her lost daughter after 22 years has an extremely fragile heart, terrified of the possibility of losing everything again.
While the two villains sealed their dark pact with a toast, mother and daughter in the Montgomery mansion lived days of pure and radiant happiness, completely unaware of the devastating storm gathering on the horizon. Isadora had already mobilized her army of brilliant lawyers to immediately begin the legal process of parental recognition and to clear Grace's name of all the fraudulent debts created by Roderick. Grace, to her mother's immense pride, showed not the slightest interest in the massive fortune or luxury items, expressing only a deep desire to resume her university studies to become a teacher. The peace of their home, however, was brutally shattered when Catherine handed Isadora a mysterious envelope with no return address, containing skillfully manipulated photographs of Grace talking intimately with Roderick in a dark, suspicious corner.
The anonymous letter venomously claimed that the young heiress was a professional imposter who, along with her dangerous accomplice, was only faking maternal love to quickly get her hands on the Montgomery money. Isadora felt the solid ground of her study disappear beneath her feet as she stared at the forged images with trembling hands, letting the poison of doubt seep through the cracks of her old emotional scars.
22 years of surviving in a ruthless business world full of snakes and family betrayals had taught the businesswoman to distrust absolutely everyone, and her greatest fear was being made a fool of once again. That same night, during their refined dinner, Isadora could not hide the coldness in her gaze, acting in a distant and calculating manner which did not escape her daughter's sharp sensitivity and trauma. Grace felt the frosty atmosphere and asked if she had done something wrong, but Isadora lied, saying it was just work fatigue, leaving the young woman to cry hidden in the blue room, haunted by the old fear of imminent abandonment. In the following days, the cruelty of the attacks orchestrated by Arnold intensified drastically, with the arrival of crudely edited audio recordings where Grace's voice seemed to confess to the plan to steal her rich mother's fortune. To make matters worse, a cheap actor hired by Roderick presented himself at Isadora's lawyer's office, swearing up and down that he had overheard Grace and her ex-boyfriend plotting the £1 million scam against the old lady together. The anguish consumed Isadora from within, cruelly torn between her maternal instinct that screamed her girl's innocence and the absolute terror of being the victim of a ruthless and destructive emotional fraud. Unable to bear the uncertainty eating away at her peace, Isadora entered the blue room in the middle of the night, holding the accusatory photographs, and demanded that Grace tell the truth about her supposed alliance with Roderick. When Grace looked at the fake photos and realized her own mother, the person who had rescued her from the hell of the streets, doubted the purity of her love and her genuine suffering, her world collapsed. With eyes wet with an indescribable pain, Grace said it didn't matter what she said now, because the simple fact that Isadora believed her tears of hunger were fake had already broken the trust between them.
Moved by wounded pride and the conviction that she would never be truly loved, Grace walked to the grand wooden wardrobe and began to pack her old tattered clothes into the same black bin bag. She declared with a choked voice that Isadora could keep all her millions, as she never wanted the dirty money, only wishing for the warmth of a mother, and prepared to return to the cruel cold of the streets. It was this exact, desperate and selfless gesture from Grace that shattered the curse of doubt in Isadora's confused mind, illuminating the truth with the cutting clarity of lightning on a pitch-black night. Isadora understood instantly that any fraud or fortune hunter would have begged on her knees, invented 1,000 elaborate excuses, and fought tooth and nail to keep her privileged position and direct access to the money. Grace, on the contrary,
preferred to feel cold and hungry again rather than stay in a place where her sincere love was questioned, proving absolutely and unquestionably that her heart was pure and incorruptible. Isadora ran across the room, hugged her daughter with protective strength, and desperately begged for forgiveness for letting fear blind her intuition, promising that they would find out together who was behind that vile slander. With family trust fully restored and strengthened by the trial by fire, Isadora called upon the ruthless Detective Turner, giving him a tight 24-hour deadline to unmask the cowards who had tried to destroy her newly formed family. Turner not only easily broke the false testimony of the mediocre actor with the simple threat of prison, but also brought Nurse Diana, now in her final days of life, to sign a full confession before a prosecutor. Armed with irrefutable evidence and the cold wrath of a mother defending her cub, Isadora set a perfect trap and invited her brother-in-law Arnold to the mansion, pretending she needed his help to disinherit Grace. The trap was set, and the criminals, blinded by greed and arrogance, walked straight into the cage that would seal their miserable fates forever. Arnold Montgomery entered the grand living room of the mansion, sporting a cynical smile and a theatrical expression of false concern, followed closely by his accomplice Roderick, both blindly believing they had won the battle. The corrupt uncle sat in the velvet armchair, poured himself some tea, and began to drip his poison, congratulating Isadora on finally opening her eyes and expelling that supposed street opportunist who tarnished the family name. Isadora listened to the pathetic performance with icy calm, keeping her hands perfectly still on her lap, waiting for the exact moment when the villain's arrogance reached its highest peak of illusory confidence.
In a dangerously soft tone of voice, Isadora asked Arnold if he remembered in detail what had happened to little Victoria on that rainy night at the hospital 22 years ago. Before the man could formulate another blatant lie, Isadora pressed a small button under the table, and the weak but unmistakable voice of Nurse Diana Rydell filled the luxurious room, confessing to the macabre crime commissioned by Arnold. The powerful businessman's face lost all color instantly,
and panic gripped Roderick, who sprang up, trying to find a desperate escape route toward the mansion's massive front door. It was then that the large, decorative folding screen burst open, revealing not only Isadora's ruthless lawyers, but also a prosecutor and several uniformed police officers with arrest warrants in hand. The cold steel handcuffs clicked onto the wrists of Arnold and Roderick, arresting them on serious charges of child abduction, financial fraud, slanderous false testimony, and attempted murder against the legitimate heiress. Grace, who had watched the downfall of the criminals from the top of the marble staircase, walked down the steps slowly, standing face to face with the monstrous uncle who had condemned her to a life of unimaginable suffering. With a serene dignity that contrasted with Arnold's defeated fury, the young woman stated that, although she had grown up on the streets picking up scraps, she had learned that a person's true value is not in their bank account, but in their character. She declared that even sleeping in the cold of the pavements, she had always been much richer and more honest than he would ever be in his miserable life, leaving the villain completely speechless as he was dragged away by the police. When the heavy wooden doors closed, mother and daughter embraced for a long time, knowing that the shadow of the past had finally been dispelled and that no one would ever be able to separate them again. A whole year had passed since that turbulent day, and the wheel of human and divine justice had placed every piece meticulously in its proper place, transforming the fates of everyone involved in the plot. Arnold was tried and sentenced to 30 years of maximum security imprisonment, losing every stolen penny, while Roderick joined him in disgrace,
locked in a damp cell without ever enjoying the wealth he so coveted. Nurse Diana passed away peacefully a few weeks after the trial, forgiven by Isadora in an act of extreme nobility, freeing her from the crushing weight she had carried for 2 long decades of silent guilt and remorse. Grace, for her part, made a brilliant return to university and graduated with top marks, determined to honor her childhood dream and use her new life to help the less fortunate.
With Isadora's immense financial and emotional support, mother and daughter founded the Grand Victoria Foundation, a network of shelters and community kitchens spread across the most vulnerable neighborhoods of the bustling city of Bath. They counted on the invaluable help of pure-hearted volunteers like the young student Philip, who dedicated his afternoons to organizing donations and ensuring the shelters operated as true homes for the homeless. The Foundation's sacred goal was to ensure that no homeless person would ever have to rummage through bins or beg for leftovers in luxury restaurants, offering hot meals and tables with clean cloths to restore the dignity stolen by misery. To celebrate this bright new phase, Isadora and Grace dressed elegantly and returned to the same exquisite restaurant where the magic of their unlikely reunion had first happened. The manager, Reginald, who in the past had almost expelled Grace with violence, now bowed in exaggerated reverence, leading the 2 illustrious women to the best table in the establishment with a nervous, subservient smile, while enjoying the same delicious chocolate dessert that marked the beginning of their journey together. An elderly gentleman with very frayed clothes and a frightened look stepped into the restaurant in an extremely timid and embarrassed manner. It was Mr. Benedict, a man worn down by family abandonment, who approached a nearby table, stammering a humble request for any leftover food. While Reginald was already preparing to drive him out harshly, Grace rose quickly, stopped the manager with a simple, firm look, and approached the old gentleman with the same healing sweetness her mother had offered her in her darkest days. She held Mr. Benedict's trembling arm and told him, with a voice full of warmth, that there were no leftovers for him there, but rather a hearty plate of food, a dignified table, and excellent company for dinner. The old man wept silent tears of deep gratitude at being treated like a valuable human being, listening to Grace tell him that the wheel of luck turns for everyone and that kindness must be passed from hand to light up the world. 3 years after this moving event, the small school built by the Foundation in the heart of an underprivileged community buzzed with joy, with Grace teaching dozens of orphan children who previously had no hope for the future. Schoolteacher Marion, an admirable colleague who shared the classroom with Grace, watched emotionally as the wealthy heiress taught the children to read, treating each student as if they were her own child. Sitting on a small, colorful wooden chair at the back of the classroom, Isadora Montgomery watched the scene, her eyes shining with pride, surrounded by children who hugged her and affectionately called her Grandma. She had sold most of her luxury hotels and drastically reduced her exhausting corporate workload, discovering that true happiness lived in her daughter's smile and the sincere embrace of those little ones. Grace ended the lesson by telling her own story of survival to the curious students, assuring them that a person's value is not in the clothes they wear or the money they possess,
but in their immense capacity to love. The setting sun illuminated the serene faces of the two women who, after overcoming the darkest storms of existence, had finally found their definitive safe harbor in each other's arms. Life, in its infinite wisdom, often weaves its most beautiful threads through the sharpest needles of suffering. When we look back, we realize that every tear shed and every closed door was not a cruel punishment,
but a strictly necessary detour to guide us to our true destiny. The pain of loneliness and the crushing weight of injustice can harden a person's outer shell, but they must never corrupt the pure essence of a genuinely good heart. A human being's true wealth is not measured by the possessions they accumulate in safe and cold vaults, but by the compassionate capacity to extend a hand when the world turns its back. A plate of food offered with absolute dignity, a look of compassion, and the rare courage to trust again even after countless betrayals suffered are the greatest acts of peaceful revolution we can perform. Family love is not born only from blood ties, but from the daily and stubborn choice to welcome, protect, and heal one another's deepest wounds. At the end of the human journey, what truly remains is not the material empire we built, but the love we spread, lighting the path of those who, just like us, one day seek only a safe and warm place to call home.